Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joe Schultz. I'm a senior undergraduate here at Ohio State, hopefully graduating this June. I also serve as the undergraduate student member of the University Board of Trustees. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees and all of the students at Ohio State, it's my privilege to welcome you here tonight to the Ohio Bicentennial Distinguished Lecture Series entitled Ohio and the World. This series has had generous sponsorship from the Ohio Bicentennial Commission, the Ohio Humanities Council, and of course the Ohio State University. It's a great time to be a student and a scholar here at the Ohio State University. Nothing demonstrates that more than the outstanding programming and opportunities we have for discovery, such as this lecture tonight. However, this lecture series will go far beyond this auditorium. All but one of the lectures will be held in another venue besides Columbus around the state. The distinguished lectures will also have the chance to interact with faculty and students from Ohio State, as well as students from local high schools, and I believe it was Centennial High School of Columbus today. In addition, the Ohio and the World lecture series will be disseminated to many students of history from around the state, from secondary school students to lifelong learners. This commitment to education allows the public to gain an appreciation for the richness, the diversity, and the impact of Ohio upon the world. And as a citizen of the state of Ohio and as a fifth-generation farmer from Western Ohio, I truly appreciate this opportunity to gain a perspective about our great state, its history, its place in the country, and its place in our world. To continue with tonight's program, it is my honor to introduce a man who, without his support, this program could not be possible, the Executive Director of Ohio's Bicentennial Commission, Mr. Steve George.
Thanks, Joe. It's really a privilege for me to be here with you this evening. I have one of those interesting jobs when I get up in the morning, I never know what I'm going to be doing. Sometimes I'm up on a ladder helping paint a barn, and other times I'm out organizing a wagon train. But it's really a delight to me when I have the opportunity to do something that involves a little bit more serious aspect to the bicentennial. In planning the bicentennial over these several years, we have tried as a commission to have a kind of balance between fun activities that people all across the state and all ages and all incomes will enjoy doing over the years past and certainly this year. Those include our signature events. We're doing a big wagon train across the state. We're bringing tall ships to Lake Erie. We're bringing Ohio river boats to Cincinnati. We're supporting a huge air show and blimp meet over in Dayton to mark the centennial of the Wright brothers. We're doing a lot of fun things, but we're also trying to do some things which tell Ohioans a little bit more about their own history, give them an opportunity to explore who they are, who their ancestors are, and in this case, also looking ahead a little bit as this lecture series concludes here in a few weeks. So it's my pleasure here to welcome you here this evening, and I'm certain that you are looking forward to it as much as I am. I'd like to introduce Susan Hartman, Professor of History, who in turn will introduce our speaker. Susan? Thank you.
It is an honor to introduce Katherine Kish Sklar, and also a great pleasure to welcome her back to her birthplace. After growing up in Columbus, she received her AB from Radcliffe College and earned her PhD at the University of Michigan. She taught history at Michigan and at UCLA, and currently is Distinguished Professor of History and co-director of the Center for the Historical Study of Women and Gender at the State University of New York at Binghamton. Professor Sklar has published prize-winning biographies. One, in fact, was a National Book Award finalist of two individuals central to the Reform tradition in the United States, Catherine Beecher and Florence Kelley. She has edited another 8 books, published dozens of articles, and created an innovative website for the teaching of women's history. The quality of her scholarship has been recognized by nearly every institution that provides research support for historians, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Ford Foundation, and more. Professor Sklar's research and teaching have a broad range. Centering on 19th and 20th century America, but with a comparative reach that includes parallel developments in Europe. I knew her first 3 decades ago when she pioneered the field of women's history. Her work and her intellectual leadership continue to shape that dynamic field, perhaps most critically in demonstrating the importance of women and gender relations to the political history of nations. Her own reputation, as well as her contributions to the field, have recently been recognized. She was named Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford University, the first time that a historian of women has ever been named to this prestigious post. Professor Sklar has made impressive contributions to our understanding of women and social movements, and more broadly, she has helped us to appreciate those Americans we call progressives, both women and men, who embraced their obligations to all of their fellow citizens and who promoted the idea of positive government, working to protect and improve the lives of those ravaged by the marketplace. Her topic tonight is Ohio, Heartland of Progressive Reform.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Susan. It's such a pleasure to be here. I have memories that are very rich and precious to me about growing up in Columbus, and I remember, of course, the campus quite well from the perspective of a young child, and I was pleased to see all the construction and how very big everything is and how very prosperous the city is. So today on my way here, as I passed a mallard duck on campus, finding a friendly pool of water that he could splash in, I thought, this is the same place. It's wonderful to be here. Ohio is justly famous as the birthplace of a remarkable string of presidents of the United States. From the election of Ulysses Grant in 1868 to that of Warren Harding in 1920, 7 Ohio-born presidents were elected to office. Even if we acknowledge that Ulysses Grant and Benjamin Harrison, though born in Ohio, put down political roots elsewhere, we see that 5 presidents from Hayes to Harding were not only born in Ohio, but also rose to political prominence from Ohio. These were, displayed clockwise in front of you, Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican, elected in 1876, James Garfield, Republican, elected in 1880, Benjamin Harrison, Republican, elected in 1888, William McKinley, Republican, elected in 1896, William Howard Taft, Republican, elected in 1908. This is an impressive political series, even to a social historian like me. Like most historians of the U.S. who were trained after 1960, I turned away from traditional political history and the careers of presidents to explore the lives of more average people, seeking patterns there that explain the larger contours of continuity and change in American history. But as I began to study Ohio history for this lecture, that string of presidents kept distracting me, like a chorus of ghosts of presidents past. They interrupted my work with their chants, "What about us? Aren't we a pattern? And too bad you can't figure us out." It didn't matter that I had little interest in the history of the Republican Party, or even in the political corruption at which several of them excelled. They kept insisting on their importance. One day I finally turned to them and said, "Okay, so you guys aren't an accident. In fact, you're the biggest pattern in the White House since the run of Virginians who became president before 1850. But what of it? With this, they became quiet, as though they had made their point. And I suddenly realized how they fit into my talk. I like the Virginia presidents before 1850, the Ohio presidents after 1860 had a knack for using local political issues to represent national political concerns. In the decades between the Civil War and World War I, that knack was sorely needed by a nation that was recovering from the ravages of civil war, at the same time that its social fabric was threatened by rapid industrialization, massive immigration, and intense urbanization. That knack provided a glue for a nation that had just come unglued and threatened to become unglued again. So I thank these presidential ghosts. They drew my attention to the connection between local and national politics and to the importance of Ohio as a region where that connection was particularly rich. Tonight I want to explore one aspect of that connection, not in the lives of these presidents, worthy though they are of study, but in the lives of less familiar players on the Ohio landscape. As I learned about these Ohio presidents, I realized that their national stature grew from their local roots, politically, from the power of the Republican Party in Ohio after the Civil War. After all, they won the war, and it was the Midwestern boys who died, whose deaths were disproportionately registered in the ranks of those who gave their lives for the Northern cause in the Civil War. Economically, from the state's geographic centrality in the nation's industrializing process, and their power also came socially from the vitality of civil society throughout Ohio. My remarks this evening have nothing to say about the first of these factors. I leave the history of the Republican Party to others who are, in fact, doing a wonderful job of it. But I do want to look at Ohio's geographic centrality within the nation's industrializing process, and then devote most of my remarks to the vitality of civil society in Ohio between 1877 and 1914. That vitality aided the flow of presidents from Ohio to Washington, D.C., and it shaped the lives of hundreds of local leaders whom we might profitably study, as well as the lives of thousands of average citizens who worked with them. We'll look at 4 local leaders, all of whom engaged in the vitality of building the vitality of Ohio's civil society in ways that made them stand out nationally. These local leaders are Washington Gladden, pastor of the First Congregational Church in Columbus from 1882 to 1914, Tom Johnson, mayor of Cleveland from 1901 to 1909, Hallie Brown, president of the Ohio Federation of Colored Women's Clubs from 1905 to 1912, Harriet Upton, treasurer of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, who brought the national headquarters of that group to Warren, Ohio from 1903 to 1910. But before we turn to their stories, let's notice Ohio's geographic centrality in the nation's industrializing process during the decades around 1900. And let's dramatize that centrality by viewing Ohio's handling of the Great Railway Strike of 1877. When Ohio celebrated the centennial of its admission to the Union in 1903, its economy was rapidly industrializing, its workforce was absorbing hundreds of thousands of migrants, and its cities were growing at unprecedented rates. As early as 1850, Ohio was at the center of transportation routes from east to west and north to south. This fine map shows us the railroads, canals, roads, rivers, and ports that made Ohio a thoroughfare for the passage of people and goods around 1850. This commercial development gave Ohio a head start in the industrialization that occurred throughout the United States between 1880 and 1920. During those decades, 9 Ohio cities grew to more than 50,000 inhabitants, as Ohio became one of the most industrialized states in the Union. In this chart, we see the growth of those 9 cities. Particularly pertinent to my remarks tonight are the rapid growth of Columbus and Cleveland. Columbus grew from more than 50,000 in 1880 to more than 230,000 in 1920, increasing by 70% in the 1880s alone, and more than 40% in each decade of the 1890s and 1900s. This dramatic growth included a mixture of foreign-born immigrants and migrants from the American countryside. Even though Cleveland was 3 times larger than Columbus in 1880, it grew at the same dramatic rate, becoming Ohio's largest city by 1900, its oil refineries and steel mills absorbing a steady cascade of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Meanwhile, Cincinnati, which thanks to the arrival of German immigrants in the 1840s and 50s was the state's largest city by 1880, grew at a much slower pace between 1880 and 1920, retaining its reliance on light industry. Other industrial cities on this chart show the pervasiveness of industrialization in Ohio. Akron, Canton, Dayton, Springfield, Toledo, and Youngstown helped transform the Ohio landscape. Pastures gave way to smokestacks, and economic changes exceeded the ability of social and political institutions to solve the problems generated by those changes. When Ohio joined the Union in 1803, it was part of a pre-industrial world in which social relations were shaped to a considerable degree by values held in common. These values were reinforced by religious, political, and social institutions. For example, most states still used tax money to support a state-established church. Political rights were limited to those who held property, and guilds regulated prices and the terms of employment. In this context, the economic marketplace was answerable to a larger moral economy that represented the welfare of the whole society in their minds. For example, it was no accident that arguments about slavery in the 1850s became moral arguments over whether that system was or was not compatible with Christianity. Between 1800 and 1850, this vision of a socially regulated moral economy was eroded by marketplace values that equated the welfare of the whole with the welfare of the individual. In this context, states ceased supporting churches with tax money. Political rights were extended universally to white men, regardless of their property holdings, and the terms of employment were unregulated. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, launched this new worldview, which a century later was known by the French anti-mercantilist term laissez-faire, or let it be. Yet this new moral economy, which imagined individuals in worlds of their own making, left many questions unanswered about what members of a democracy owed to one another and how that responsibility should be exercised. Those questions were dramatically revealed and became more imperative during the Great Railway Strike of 1877, which marked the transition from pastures to smokestacks in Ohio and elsewhere. Let's look at that strike nationally and then in Ohio to see what it can tell us about the importance of civil society in the lives of average people and the vitality of civil society in Ohio. The Great Railway Strike had all the elements of the dark side of emerging modern America: unrelenting economic depression, desperate working people unable to feed their families, large corporations accountable to no one but their own investors, and perhaps most ominously, the violent repression of the strike by state militias backed up by federal troops. Railroads, the vanguard of industrialization in the U.S., occupied center stage in this drama. In the 1860s and 70s, railroads had forged a national market connecting East and West, North and South in a network that employed more workers than any other industry, and itself constituted an important market for iron, steel, coal, and other industries. Railroads produced great wealth for a few, but the contraction of the industry in the economic depression that began in 1873 steadily impoverished hundreds of thousands of railroad workers and their families in the 1870s. By 1877, unemployment reached 25% nationwide, and underemployment meant that most jobs were not full-time. Newspapers reported cases of starvation and suicide. The strike began in the summer of 1877 in Baltimore when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced its second wage cut that year, and protesting workers refused to let trains move until the cut was restored. Sympathy strikes spread along the railroads in every direction from city to city, drawing in workers in other industries. In many cities, businessmen, alienated by the railroad's monopolistic power, sided with the strikers. In St. Louis, a general strike stopped the city for nearly a week. President Rutherford Hayes, governor of Ohio previously, responded to the political power of railroad executives by making federal troops available to governors to put down what had become a nationwide rebellion. Justified as necessary to keep the federal mails moving in mid-July, U.S. troops equipped with Gatling guns rode from city to city on railway cars recently wrested from the control of striking workers. Federal troops and state militias assaulted unarmed crowds of strikers and strike supporters. In Baltimore, the state militia fired into a crowd of 2,000 unarmed men, women, and children, killing 10 and wounding many others. In Pittsburgh, militiamen killed 20 men, women, and children. From the outskirts of Pittsburgh, angry miners and steel workers, that is not railroad workers, broke into a gun factory, armed themselves, and attacked the troops who retreated into a railway roundhouse. A bloody street battle ensued the next day as the troops fought for their lives to escape the avenging throng. Militia also fired on crowds in Chicago, whereas in other major cities, angry strikers destroyed railroad tracks and buildings worth millions of dollars. In all, about 100 lives were lost in what one newspaper called the Lexington of the labor conflict at hand. But what about Ohio? Did the president's authorization of federal troops reflect the intensity of class warfare in Ohio? Or do we find another pattern here? In Ohio, the strike centered in Newark, east of Columbus. Newark was the headquarters of the B&O's Trans-Ohio Division and a central point for the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis Railroad. The railroad yards there covered 10 acres with a variety of repair shops, roundhouses, and sliding tracks. Although many of the strike's ingredients in Newark resembled those in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and Chicago, the outcome was quite different. No violence occurred. Why not? Historian Brian Lynn, who has written about the strike in Newark, credits moderation on all sides. The deliberate effort to avoid violence by the governor, the attorney general, the state militia, and the strikers themselves. Yet Lynn's evidence from newspaper accounts of the strike invites another interpretation. Through popular culture, they found a way to compete, the militia and the strikers, without killing one another. We can follow events in Newark through Ohio's newspapers, which covered the strike closely. After 300 strikers seized control of the Newark yards on July 18, railroad officials demanded that the governor mobilize the National Guard to protect railway property and non-striking workers who, managers said, wanted to work. Meanwhile, strikers prudently sequestered only commercial freight cars and permitted mail cars to proceed through the city. On July 21, the governor himself traveled to Newark with 4 guard companies from Springfield, Mount Vernon, Circleville, and Zanesville, totaling 170 men. Yet when the strikers held their ground and militiamen found it difficult to move among the stranded freight cars in the yards, the outnumbered Springfield soldiers, according to a Dayton newspaper, put down their guns and challenged their opponents to a game of baseball. We don't have a picture of that game, but the closest I could get is a baseball team from Columbus in 1884, just to give you a sense of the baseball spirit in the 70s and 80s when the game was young. The next day, the governor brought in 7 more companies from Cincinnati and Dayton, bringing the guard total to 530. Mutual threats between strikers and militiamen stopped short of violence, however. One striker's diary said, quote, "The soldiers made a charge at the railroad boys, but they stood firm and dared them to touch them," unquote. This standoff became the basis for a larger settlement. Strikers agreed to leave the yards, and militia commanders agreed they would not try to move the trains with non-striking workers. Both sides claimed victory. During the next week, militia, striking workers, and townspeople peacefully interacted in Newark's public space. Expressing their appreciation of the guardsmen's decision not to move the trains, local people cheered the militia as they marched through the town, performing special drills. In response, soldiers entertained the populace with baseball games, drilling demonstrations, singing, and plays. Families of strikers offered food to the guardsmen, and the soldiers politely admired Newark's bells. The head of Cincinnati's regiment wired the governor, "Send us home, we are not needed here." Everyone went home except the Springfield regiment, who, according to newspaper reports, organized a glee club, staged a, quote, "very natural can-can." I suppose that means men doing it, and played more baseball. A week later, after the strike had been broken in other cities, the militia returned in force to Newark, and meeting no resistance, peacefully ended the strike by protecting workers who put the trains back in motion. The social fabric held. Men with guns from neighboring Ohio cities did not fire their weapons at the people of Newark. To achieve this outcome, leadership at the state level mattered. The governor ordered militia commanders to exercise, quote, "discretion and judgment." And the state attorney general, very importantly, refused to enlist the aid of private companies offering to, quote, "put down this infamous riot and insurrection," unquote. Regimental leadership must also have been important in maintaining the soldiers' disciplined good spirits. But above all, it seems to me, strikers and militia related to one another as members of a shared culture and prized their commonality over their differences. The recent invention of baseball helped, but underlying that popular culture was a civil society in which strikers and militia saw themselves as fellow citizens. A Dayton paper expressed that sentiment well, writing, "It is a most serious thing for militia to fire upon their fellow citizens," unquote. Civil society is a concept that has become especially important for historians of the Progressive Era because it refers to those sectors of society between the state and the economy in which in the Progressive Era became all important in devising a new moral economy to fit the new commercial economy. A good definition of civil society is offered by the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy at Duke University. Quote, "Civil society refers to that sphere of voluntary associations and informal networks in which individuals and groups engage in activities of public consequence. It is distinguished from the public activities of government because it is voluntary, and from the private activities of markets because it seeks common ground and public goods. For democratic societies, it provides an essential link between citizens and the state. Its fundamental appeal, since its origin in the Scottish Enlightenment, is its attempt to synthesize public and private good," unquote. So by this definition, when the Springfield militia put down their guns and began to play ball, they shifted from representing the state to representing civil society. That is, they became a voluntary association trying to synthesize public and private good. This description of their actions might seem grander than their intentions, but it seems safe to assume that on that July day in Newark, they decided that both their own private good and the public good was better solved by baseball than by guns. I like this definition's use of the term common ground, which is an especially useful concept for historical analysis of the Progressive Era because it calls our attention to the sites where people from different social locations meet and try to overcome their differences. In times of profound transformation like the Progressive Era, these sites are not yet routinized, so innovations like that of the Springfield Militia at Newark become all the more significant. In this case, the baseball diamond was literally as well as symbolically common ground. While the baseball game in Newark was unique, this pattern of valuing commonality over difference became quite prominent in Ohio's most successful leaders during the Progressive Era. That pattern speaks to the strength of civil society in Ohio during these years of profound tradition and the importance of civil society as a means by which both the state and the economy remained accountable to the larger society of which they were a part. This pattern of valuing commonality over difference is strikingly evident in two of the best-known local leaders in Ohio during the Progressive Era, Reverend Washington Gladden and businessman Tom Johnson. Thanks to Jacob Dorn's magisterial biography of Washington Gladden, we know how Gladden used his pulpit at the First Congregational Church in Columbus from 1882 to 1914 to become the father of the social gospel movement in American Protestantism. Theologically, he sacralized daily life as the site where religion was tested as to whether or not it was genuine. Politically, he spoke out against trends that eroded the common ground that citizens shared. Socially, he created a dialogue with others to seek shared solutions to social problems. Throughout his career, he expanded the common ground that people could share despite their differences: businessmen and workers, African Americans and whites, women and men. Gladden's theology first appeared in his 1877, that important year, in his book that year, The Christian Way, Whither It Leads and How to Go On, which called for the extension of Christian values into everyday life. This book launched his leadership in the social gospel movement, a movement historians have described as stepping outside the churches to intersect the political, social, and economic forces of changing America. By sacralizing everyday life, Gladden and others made these political, social, and economic forces relevant to their ministry. For him, the public space was sacred space, and municipal government a sacred undertaking. City Hall was the place where, quote, all the civic organizations and agencies for the preservation of the peace and the promotion of public welfare have their headquarters. Its functions are just as religious as the functions of the church. Because his church stood across the street from the state capitol, his congregation included a sizable number of state legislators. Perhaps for this reason, he ventured further into politics than most ministers, serving on the Columbus City Council and using his pulpit to advocate legislation, especially legislation that curbed the power of private monopolies that provided public utilities. To combat these profiteers, Gladden called for public ownership of streetcar lines, electricity, and other public utilities. He urged parishioners and other allies to become more politically active and reclaim control of municipal government. Here, Gladden's crusade is depicted in a 1905 cartoon that symbolized his national as well as local prominence in the social gospel movement. He's leading a crusade on entrenched economic interests in municipal government. But Gladden went beyond good government to call for social justice in a variety of forms. At a time when the lynching of African Americans in the South was tolerated by most Northerners as a Southern custom for punishing criminals, his 1903 sermon, Murder as an Epidemic, condemned lynching. That year, he spoke at the 8th Annual Conference on the Negro, sponsored by W.E.B. Du Bois at Atlanta University, met Du Bois, and read his path-breaking 1903 book, Souls of Black Folk. in which Du Bois called for full political rights for African Americans and rejected Booker T. Washington's efforts to advance black economic progress without advancing black political rights. Deeply affected by Du Bois, Gladden wrote in 1903, quote, "The health, the peace, the vigor of our national life are involved in the destiny of this race," unquote. As president of the American Missionary Association, a group that had helped found Atlanta University and other black colleges during Reconstruction, Gladden said the nation faced a choice between elevating African Americans to full citizenship or reducing them to serfdom. Both processes were underway, he said, but the Christian doctrine of brotherhood was on the side of full citizenship. Responding to his address, African Americans at the Shiloh Baptist Church in Columbus passed a resolution of gratitude. Printed in American Magazine, Gladden's address placed him in the ranks of the nation's most progressive leaders on the race question. Gladden also went beyond good government when he called for more equitable distribution of wealth. That's a quote from him, more equitable distribution of wealth. In 1906, he addressed the New York State Conference of Religion on, quote, "the relation of moral teachers to predatory wealth," unquote. And his 1909 recollections denounced the growing wealth inequalities of the Gilded Age as unchristian. Quote, "In a society in which the Christian law was recognized as the practical rule, there could be no such enormous accumulations in the hands of individuals as those which have been heaped up on the last 25 years. Such swollen fortunes are the symptoms of social disease. They have the same relation to social health that hydrocephalus or elephantitis has to the health of the individual and to all sound moral vision. They are not less repulsive," unquote. How did Gladden succeed in selling his aggressive reform agenda to his congregation? After all, he lived in a time when the state was not supporting churches with taxes. Ministers had to go to their congregation, and if the congregation didn't like you, guess what? You were out the door. The more he took on social problems of his day, however, the more popular Gladden became. Church membership rose from under 500 in 1883 to 900 in 1902 and over 1,200 in 1914. Gladden's reform agenda was consistent with some, but not all, of his congregation, which included the city's elite, businessmen, professionals, and educators. Many of them may have been searching for answers to the pressing social, political, and economic questions of the day, but they probably did not agree among themselves about those answers. Jacob Dorn's research found that in 1902, about 1 in 4 of OSU's faculty members attended Gladden's church, an astonishingly high percent. And many university students attended regularly, even though they were not members, including Arthur M. Schlesinger, who later became a distinguished historian of American cities. Representing a different spectrum of opinion within the congregation were leaders of the Columbus Board of Trade, almost half of the presidents of the board before 1902, and many of its directors. Gladden himself was an active member of the Columbus Board of Trade. Other congregants included bankers, owners, or directors of Ohio mines and railroads, and the owner of the largest mine equipment company in the country. Gladden did not try to bring all these people with him on every issue. Instead, he created common ground with a Sunday evening group, which was attended primarily by men, only about a third of whom were regular members of his congregation. On Sunday morning, Gladden spoke about salvation and religious matters, but on Sunday evening sermons, his Sunday evening sermons discussed the lives of exemplary men such as Henry Ward Beecher, works of recent criticism such as Upton Sinclair's 1906 book, The Jungle, or current events such as social conditions in Europe or famine in India. This self-selected group of supporters gave Gladden a forum to test his ideas and share solutions for contemporary social, economic, and political problems. This common ground became larger when Gladden's Sunday evening sermons began to appear in the Monday papers, creating an even wider forum for discussion. Thus, we might say that Gladden's Sunday night meetings became his equivalent of Newark's baseball games during the during the 1877 strike, the common ground where he interacted with others to build more democratic alternatives to the status quo. Turning to Cleveland, an example of Mayor Tom Johnson, we find that his leadership helped create common ground on the most contested site in urban politics, streetcar lines. Because streetcars carried people into and out of the nation's burgeoning cities from the outlying districts where most of them lived, urban dwellers depended on them to get to work. Streetcars were as important to working people as their jobs, since without them they couldn't reach their jobs. People cared passionately about how much of their income went to streetcar fares, whether a streetcar strike might prevent them from working, and, as we'll see, the routes that streetcar lines followed. This is one of many images that come to us from this period of people during a streetcar strike protesting the lack of the ability of workers on the lines and the government to run streetcar lines without interruption. Streetcar line franchises were so profitable that they attracted businessmen whose wealth was well established. In many ways, these franchises were the equivalent of today's military contracts, just as lucrative, just as heavily politicized, and just as capable of distorting public policy. Before we hear how Johnson created common ground on this contested terrain, let's survey the territory as he found it when he came to Cleveland in 1879. At that time, streetcar franchises were dominated by Mark Hanna, who entered the business from the top as one of Ohio's wealthiest and most powerful businessmen, who had already grown rich as a shipper and broker, moving Great Lakes ore deposits through the port of Cleveland to Ohio's steel mills. Muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens, the nation's foremost authority on municipal corruption and the author of the 1904 book, Shame of the Cities, described Hanna's quest for streetcar profits as quixotic. This cartoon, this image shows us depicting the power of Hanna's wealth in his hands there. In the election of 1896, with William Jennings Bryan, hanging William Jennings Bryan, defeating William Jennings Bryan in that election, in which Hanna's picked candidate McKinley became president. So you get a sense of the national, this comes from a New York newspaper, of the national power of this man, Mark Hanna, in 1896. And in 1905, Lincoln Steffens, muckraking journalist, wrote in a magazine article his description. He came to Cleveland and tried to figure out what is the deal with Mark Hanna and the streetcar lines in Cleveland. Hanna, having come into politics in Cleveland through the streetcar lines. And so Stevens described Hanna's quest for streetcar profits as quixotic. Quote, Hanna had largely of the earth and the waters under the earth. He had reached out far beyond Cleveland and Ohio for possessions, into Minnesota and New York, Michigan and Pennsylvania, and his hands were full. But he had no street railway. Of course, he had to have one. As Stevens continued, and that's how Hanna happened to go into politics. Mr. Hanna did not want to go into politics. He had to. It was necessary to his streetcar business that he should, and it was for the sake of his business that he did. To Stevens, the results were clear. Quote, as a businessman in politics, he corrupted politics. Mr. Hanna boodled, the period's word for bribe. He degraded the municipal legislature of Cleveland. I don't say he did it alone. I don't say he started it. I don't say he wanted to do that. All Mr. Hanna wanted was that horse car line, and then some extensions, and then some more franchises. But these he did want, and these and other valuable privileges. Since he wanted them, he must have them, and since the business way to get a thing is to go and pay for it and get it, Mr. Hanna went and got his privileges, he bought and paid for them, unquote. Stevens described government in Cleveland in the 1880s and 90s as, quote, government by the public utility companies. The head of Cleveland's government resided not in City Hall, but in Hanna's West Side Company, and those who did business with the city knew to go there rather than to City Hall. The city's elite tolerated Hanna's rule. Steffens deftly characterized their involvement, quote, Hanna's was not a very bad government, not in the Tammany sense. There was not much police blackmail, for example. It was financial, respectable corruption that prevailed. And good citizens do not resent that so much. It is quiet, it is convenient, it is theirs. It is the system. Hanna's government of Cleveland was a government of the people by politicians hired to represent the privileged class, unquote. But after Hanna installed William McKinley in the White House and himself in the U.S. Senate in 1896, he began to lose control of Cleveland and created opportunities for our hero, Tom Johnson. Johnson's economic base in Cleveland rested on his innovation as a streetcar businessman who succeeded in providing people with longer rides for lower fares, primarily by developing lines that ran across the city and helped people move about the city during the day, not just as Hanna's did, for commuters in the morning and evening to move between the suburbs and the city center. Hanna's system required people to pay 2 fares if they wanted to ride in the city as well as into the city. Johnson's reconfiguration of the space that streetcars traversed was not accidental. For him, streetcars were more than a cash cow. He cared about how streetcars actually worked, as his 30 patents related to the industry demonstrate, and how streetcars served the needs of people who used them. Yet, although historians have characterized Johnson as the origin of the idea that streetcars should carry people through and around the city, inside the city, as well as in and out, a recent dissertation has shown that well before Johnson's innovation, working people had petitioned the city for just such lines. Johnson's real innovation, therefore, was to pay attention to those petitions and to make common ground with the petitioners. The same dissertation also shows that when Johnson ran for mayor in 1901, his strongest support came from working class wards with a high percentage of immigrants from Central Europe. They made common ground with him. After his election, Johnson became what Lincoln Steffens called the best mayor of the best governed city in the United States. And that for Lincoln Steffens was saying a lot. He tried to find what he could about Johnson, and that's what he ended up saying. He's the best mayor in the best governed city. Johnson achieved national prominence by becoming the best local politics could achieve. Mark Hanna called him a socialist, anarchist, nihilist. But Stevens saw him as a respectable businessman who made good government a hobby. Quote, when some men go in for yachting or the Senate and give money to charity and churches, colleges, and libraries, Tom Johnson gave himself and his money to politics, to municipal reform as the mayor of Cleveland, unquote. Johnson's reform of city government was effective in part because he came from within the streetcar system of politics and knew where the bodies were buried. He knew why the city's water system was polluted, why the schools were inadequate, and the tax valuations unfair. His hands were not completely clean. Yet his alliance with the needs of average people created common ground that improved the lives of all of Cleveland's citizens. Now, you may have noticed that our vignettes of Newark, Columbus, and Cleveland have included no women. Those stories might seem complete without women except for one thing. We don't really know why so many leaders in Ohio and elsewhere constructed common ground during the tumultuous decades around 1900. Common ground was needed, but it was also needed in the 1850s when the nation threatened to dissolve over the expansion of slavery, and it didn't emerge then. So why should it have emerged during the Progressive Era? One important answer to that question is the massive entrance of women into civil society in the decades between 1870 and 1910, which enormously increased the sheer numbers of people who were seeking common ground with one another. Historians have analyzed the female-specific organizational structure and content of women's public activism between 1870 and 1910, but it seems to me they have not adequately accounted for the way women strengthen civil society generally, particularly in the main job that we have seen civil society doing, finding common ground across differences. You remember that we define civil society as, quote, voluntary associations and informal networks in which individuals and groups engage in activities of public consequence, unquote. We can quite specifically date the burgeoning of women's voluntary associations that engaged in activities of public consequence as the Depression winter of 1873-74 with the founding in Hillsboro, Ohio, of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Although women were publicly active in anti-slavery and moral reform and women's rights organizations before the Civil War, and indeed that activity formed a foundation for the flowering of the WCTU in the 1870s, the national scale of the WCTU was unprecedented, as was its aggressive reform agenda. As early as 1878, for example, the national WCTU endorsed women's suffrage. Ohio had the largest number of unions, of course, 208. And by 1890, 125 secular newspapers in Ohio regularly ran columns that described the activities of local unions. This means pretty much every village or every town of any consequence was reporting regularly on the WCTU in its local manifestation. And here we have an image of the Cleveland Central Friendly Inn in 1885, where in Cleveland, as in villages and cities across the United States, the WCTU created common ground among middle-class women, both white and African American, about a social agenda that to a considerable extent provided social services for poor families. That was really what the WCTU was about, was a social agenda that provided social services for poor families. For example, in Cleveland, in the Central Friendly Inn in 1885, one could find cheap food and lodging for men, women, and children, a dispensary for babies, public baths, a gymnasium, and a playground. Thus, Cleveland's middle-class women created common ground with the city's working poor. In 1890, nationwide, the WCTU was strong and rich with 150,000 dues-paying members and many statewide unions. We get a sense of the scale of the WCTU in this photograph of the Woman's Temple, a hotel and office building for women that the WCTU constructed in downtown Chicago. The WCTU's motto, "Do Everything," meant that it encouraged women's public activism on a wide range of issues, which it organized into departments such as prison reform and poverty. By 1890, 25 of its 38 departments had little or nothing to do with temperance and everything to do with a social agenda that provided social services for working poor people. Beginning in 1890, a whole new scale of women's activism emerged in which the WCTU was supplanted by dozens of more secular women's organizations, such as the General Federation of Women's Clubs. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, formed in 1890 from the merger of the American and National Woman Suffrage Associations, began to play a much more prominent role in civil society. And the social settlement movement replaced the WCTU as the vanguard of women's reform activism. Women members of Washington Gladden's church reflected that vanguard in 1905 when they formed the Gladden Community Center, a social settlement that maintained a kindergarten, library, and reading rooms, district nursing service, domestic science classes, music and dramatic clubs, and gymnastic activities. This group quickly became the most important social settlement in Columbus. Social settlements were a crucially important means by which middle-class Americans built civic ties with working-class people during the decades around 1900. The first settlement was founded in New York in 1886 by Stanton Coit, a native of Columbus and a friend of Washington Gladden. Nationally, settlements grew in number from 6 in 1891 to 74 in 1897, over 100 in 1900, and 400 by 1910. Then, about 1900, another exponential expansion of women's activism occurred with the emergence of groups like the National Consumers League with even more aggressive social reform agendas. With the aid of 64 local consumer leagues, for example, Ohio's was the strongest in the National Consumers League. Ohio was the strongest of these 64 locals. The National Consumers League between 1900 and 1920 almost single-handedly obtained the passage of state maximum hours and minimum wage laws, which during the New Deal became the basis for the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. By that time, the Ohio Consumers League was by far the strongest of the local leagues, and the National Consumers League moved its headquarters to Cleveland. Thus, before the passage of the Woman Suffrage Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1920, beginning with the WCTU in the 1870s and 80s, women constituted a parallel civil society universe that may not be visible when historians look at men's participation in civil society, but like the dark matter of our own physical universe, it may account for the way civil society held together during the stressful decades of industrialization following the Civil War. Let's conclude with a few examples from the lives of Hallie Brown and Harriet Upton to see how important Ohio women were within women's public activism during those decades. Hallie Brown's family, and this image of Hallie Brown has an arrow, perhaps you can see it drawn to where she is standing in the middle. This picture was taken, yes, okay, we'll get to the picture in a minute. Hallie Brown's family moved to Wilberforce, Ohio, so that she and her brother could attend Wilberforce University, the oldest private African-American university in the United States, from which she graduated in 1873. She became a prominent speaker for the WCTU, lecturing in England before Queen Victoria in 1897. In 1893, she was instrumental in the creation of the Colored Women's League of Washington, D.C., a forerunner of the National Association of Colored Women founded in D.C. in 1896. In 1905, she returned to Wilberforce and began a second career teaching elocution. There she founded the Neighborhood Club, and from 1905 to 1912 was president of the Ohio Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. From 1920 to 1924, she served as president of the National Association of Colored Women. A wonderful example of the connection between local and national public activism, Hallie Brown is pictured here in the year before her death in 1949 at the dedication of the library that bears her name at Wilberforce. Harriet Taylor Upton is our last wonderful example of the way that the richness of Ohio's civil society shaped national life during the decades between 1870 and 1920. Born in 1853, she grew up in Warren, Ohio, her father a lawyer and circuit court judge. And after graduating from high school, she regularly accompanied her father on his court rounds. She was, of course, a member of the WCTU. And as a young woman in the mid-1870s, her knowledge of legal culture and her familiarity with women's circumstances throughout the county caused her to be elected secretary of the Trumbull County WCTU. In 1880, her father was elected to Congress to fill the seat vacated by James Garfield's after the latter's election as president. Harriet went with her father to Washington, D.C. and because he was a widower, became, during his 13 years as a congressman, his hostess at home and his companion as he went to the social events that greased the wheels of Washington's political culture, developing a close and easy relationship with national Republican leaders. In 1884, she married George Upton, a close associate of her father, who later became his law partner, living in Warren, Ohio when Congress was not in session, but in Washington, D.C. when Congress met. Soon after she joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association in 1890, Susan B. Anthony spotted her as a popular woman in Washington with a down-home, Midwestern style, and thought, this woman can help me shape this organization into something people like. Stories of the time, if you look up Harriet Taylor Upton and you find what newspapers said about her at the time, they described her very often as a suffragette with charm. As though this is something. But it was her Ohio-ness, I think, that very much attracted Susan B. Anthony as she was trying to remake the image of this organization into something that was normal, that normal people did this. In 1903, as Ohio was celebrating the centennial of its statehood that very year, Harriet Upton moved the headquarters of the National American Woman Suffrage Association to the county courthouse in Warren, Ohio. A fabulous example of the connection between local Ohio politics and national political agendas. As her voluminous correspondence with Susan B. Anthony shows, Upton was a superb fundraiser and expert press agent. Anthony would tell her where and when various suffrage speakers were appearing throughout the nation, and Upton would be sure that local newspapers carried the story. These vignettes of Ohio leaders during the Progressive Era have shown us how participants in what we have called civil society created common ground across the social, economic, and political differences that separated citizens into groups based on their class, race, ethnicity, and gender. Although much of this activity was undertaken by groups of women and men acting separately, and within those divisions by groups separated by race or ethnicity or class, combined, they strengthened the social fabric of democracy and addressed the challenges posed by industrialization, massive immigration, and urbanization. Did government value the property rights of corporations above the lives of working people? Yes. Were the needs of immigrants and working people ignored by the well-to-do? Yes. Did the city's rapid development breed corruption? Yes. Was the society segregated by race, class, and gender? Yes. But those anti-democratic trends were constantly counteracted by citizens who used public space to build a more inclusive society. And Ohioans did more than their share of that important work. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Kitty has agreed to answer questions for a few minutes. We want you to stay for the reception, but right now you have a chance to ask questions.
We should get some buses together and make a trip to Warren County Courthouse, don't you think? Yes.
Yeah, I haven't been to the Warren County Courthouse, but they did a restoration a few years back. It's beautiful. But my question is, who's created the common ground now, or is it happening?
Oh gosh, I have to put on my citizen hat. You know, that's the question. I wish I had an aggressive social agenda, you know, and 64 locals to back me up. Well, you can answer that question as well as I can. I think in many ways it's the same people. Unions, as in the railway workers. I think that it's like urgently important that legislation that prohibits their development be challenged and turned around so that unions can develop in this country. I think that churches are doing important work We have with us now tonight among us the pastor of the First Congregational Church in Columbus today, who is doing important work and has a wonderful button. Where are you? Here you are, right, and you can, I hope, attend the reception and receive questions from people about your agenda. Unfortunately, for our time, the churches that are more active are those that you might characterize as operating on a sort of Old Testament retribution theology than a New Testament love theology. So we need more activities in churches. Women's organizations have undergone a very big change as women have more options in their lives and are less crowded into these voluntary associations that offered them the best use of their talents during the progressive period. So the loss of a lot of female talent into other worlds is definitely a factor, I think, in our society today. But we do have women's groups that are very concerned about the welfare of all people, including the welfare of working people. I could go on, but you, I'm sure, can supply answers that are just as good as mine. You know, there is an interpretation out there that civil society, the weakening of civil society in our own time is like fatal. I don't believe that. I think that civil society is alive and well in this country. I think it needs leadership, and it looks like Ohio's got to provide it, so face up to it. You know, I don't know enough about the suffrage movement in Ohio to answer that question, unfortunately. I was very impressed with what Harriet Taylor Upton seemed to be doing everything in Cleveland. She headed the referendum of 1912 and 1914. Then she also headed the movement to get the state to endorse the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which it finally did in 1920. Ohio was late in the suffrage movement. So as I kept reading more about what she was doing, she edited a magazine that was the official publication of the National American Suffrage Association called Progress, which she began editing in 1907. It's wonderful, wonderful to look at that periodical because a lot of what its pages consist of is lists of local activities. It's fabulous to look at that and to see every village there is stuff happening. The suffrage movement is happening. And yet she was really in charge of so much that it made me wonder, was Ohio really late because she couldn't share? You know? So I really think this deserves more scholarship, and I think my colleague Susan Hartman is better prepared to answer that question than I am.
But not tonight.
But not tonight, okay.
There's a question there.
I guess my question is one of where was the activism focused? I mean, today we have a slogan, act locally, think globally. Did the folks you talk about in Ohio as leaders, did they perceive a national agenda for their work, or they focused primarily locally, or perhaps were they focused locally knowing that was the key to getting national reform?
I think it varied, but that motto, act locally, think globally, has been in my mind as I've been working on this lecture, and I think in lots of ways they were act locally, think nationally. that they saw the local problems as not unique, you know, that it's not unique, that there are not public services for people. It's not, and that their commitment to their work arose from a sense of national as well as local urgency. And but one way that you can look at this and make a more definitive statement is to see the national networks that they are part of. They're all very much involved in national networks. As for example, Gladden in that American Missionary Association work, where he was really put a lot of time into that. So these are people who are networked nationally, but their prominence in those networks doesn't come about from serving on national committees. It comes about from solving immediate social problems on their own turf. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
One more? Mm-hmm.
I was just going to add to that, that you're right on target. In Gladden's case, there were times in his frustration with Columbus and the inability to move things here that he wanted to leave and go on the national scene, and his nationally prominent friends said, stay where you are because you're making it huge if you're not where you are. So I just want to back that up.
That's wonderful.
Wonderful exchanges through letters and correspondence that indicate that it is important to stay focused where you are.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So the lesson here is to engage locally as the best strategy for achieving goals that are translocal.
One more? Well, I hope
Thank
that you
you.
will continue these questions outside in the hall. I do want to thank all of you for coming and to invite you to join us and Professor Sklar in the rotunda for a reception. I also want to invite you to the next lecture. James Patterson will be speaking on Ohio and the World, 1953. My note here says Monday. My memory says Wednesday. I want to make sure that this is correct. It's next Wednesday in this same place at 7:30. And finally, I want to invite you to sign a book outside if you would like to get notices of future events sponsored by the History Department. We would love to have your name and address on our mailing list. And now, please join me once again in thanking Professor Sklar.
Thanks so much.